If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. For those who hike and camp deep in the woods, have you ever had a scary encounter with an unknown creature or thing? My husband and I are currently camping on BLM land, Bureau of Land Management. He prefers not to use the bathroom in our house, so he went to the outhouse. After about 20 minutes, he comes back and is really freaked out. He asked me if I was outside the bathroom, meowing at him. I told him I wasn't, I'd been inside reading a book and cuddling our dogs. He said he kept hearing a meow in my voice. I know a meow, so obviously a possible cat is what you're thinking. My husband and I meow at each other. We've been doing this for over 15 years, and I have a specific way I do it that can't really be mistaken for a cat. I usually meow when I want him to come look at something. That's what he swears he heard. He said he felt dread each time he heard it, and all the hair on his arms stood up. I questioned him if there was any chance it was a cat at all, and he said there was no doubt that it was a human pretending to meow, but exactly my voice. He's so freaked out that he refuses to leave the bus or let me take the dogs out. What do you make of this? Should I be worried? About 20 years ago, we were hiking down in southern Oregon, and at one point, I heard a couple of loud crashing sounds about 50 yards away in the forest. I stopped and looked in the direction the sounds came from, and I was sure that I could see a large face staring back at me. I stood there for several minutes, and it did not move. I made a mark on the trail where I had been looking, and we went on our way further along the trail. Later that afternoon, when we came back to that spot, I looked at where I had seen the face, and there was an empty space I could now see, which confirmed that something large had been looking back at me earlier. A couple of years later, I read an account of a guy who would hike up that trail and camp there with his 2 dogs. He had said the dogs would often chase off bobcats, bears, and cougars. One night the dogs ran off chasing something and shortly came back terrified and hid in the tent. Whenever this guy would try to take his dogs there, they were still terrified and would refuse to go there again. He had reported this account to a local Bigfoot discussion group, and others confirmed similar experiences in that area. After last night, I am a believer that skinwalkers exist and still roam freely. I am still terrified of what I saw, and I wasn't the only one who witnessed it. My girlfriend and I had just gotten into our vehicle and were about to head out for a drink around 10:30 p.m. now. Before I continue, I want to paint a little picture of our surroundings, but I don't want to give much information about my specific location or anything, just to be safe. I will say we are staying in public lodging in Montana on a hiking trip or vacation. Our vehicle was in a fairly vacant lot, with a 12-fenced enclosure at the end of it. We had just gotten into our car, like I said before, and when I turned the vehicle on, the automatic lights flipped on, revealing what I immediately knew had to be a SW. It sprung forward from its previous sitting position and ran about 3 very fast steps before leaving over this fence. And its body. Its body scared the duck out of me. It had light tan skin, but it was very spindly. Think Slender Man build, but it was only about 6 to 7 feet tall. Its arms were long as shit, with thin, long fingers that looked almost like claws. The head had a human shape to it, but so did the eyes. It turned to look at us in that brief moment, and there was no light reflection from the eyes. Nothing. Just black. It all happened in less than 5 seconds. I turned toward my girlfriend, hoping I didn't see what I just saw. She sat there, staring at that fence, and could only whisper, "Drive." I couldn't move. I kept saying, "That was a ducking skinwalker, that was a ducking skinwalker." Before she finally was able to turn towards me and basically scream at me to drive, I got us the duck out of there, and we proceeded to go to the bar and get shit-faced, refusing to talk about it. We got a ride back and got our vehicle in the morning. She still won't talk to me about it. But I think, according to legends, you're not supposed to talk about it? I live in Hawaii, and I was on a hike up a big mountain when I saw it. It floated by my face, not too fast. I was able to see it for 2 to 3 full seconds. It was completely black and opaque and didn't move its body. It didn't move its wings either, which were also opaque. Its body was thin, and it had a bigger head. It looked like someone carved it out of black marble. Its facial features were not very pronounced. Its eyes were a little big and just sunken into the face. I didn't see any pupils or anything like that, just depressions where eyes would be. The nose and mouth were small. It didn't have breasts or genitalia. It looked like a mannequin down there, just a nub. I could see some of its ribs because it was thin. It didn't look unhealthy, though. Anyone have some thoughts on this? Well, where I was in New Mexico, coyotes are common, and so I knew where I was staying. I was going to see a few, or at least hear them in the night howling. But what weirded me out was that while I was eating by the campfire, it was starting to get a little dark, but I could still see. I start hearing the barking and howling of a coyote. I pay no mind because I didn't think that a coyote would come near a campfire, but then I realized that it's only one dog that I hear. This is weird because coyotes are pack animals for the most part, and it's getting closer, so I'm chilling out and about to go to bed when I start hearing footsteps that sound like a dog, and I can hear it getting closer, and I'm not really in the mood to have that thing eating all my food. So I have this 357 loaded with snake shot, for rattlers and weirdos alike, so I just shoot a round into the ground, and I remember hearing something run off, and at this point I was tired and had some more hiking to do in the morning, so I turned in. I woke up a couple more times at night and heard something walking around my tent and campsite. It eventually walked off after about 15 minutes, so I went back to bed. When I woke up, I found that it was human footprints around my campsite, and I thought I was just going crazy, or maybe I mistook it for a coyote, but while I was following the tracks, they slowly turned in the coyote tracks, and that's when I remembered a story a friend told me about skinwalkers, and I remember he told me that you don't duck with skinwalkers, and the best thing to do is to just get out of Dodge. This happened in July of this year, in the northeastern part of Arizona, south of the Native American reservation. There was one time I went camping with two of my buddies, but neither of them are real outdoorsy types. I was just kind of getting them into the whole camping and hunting scene. Now, I love hiking. Exploring, more like, because I hate just walking a trail. You're seeing nothing new. So they took the two friends out there a ways and got 2 miles from camp when they just wanted to go back. I said fine, showed them where to go on my phone, and made them put a waypoint on the other little GPS thing I had to follow. I wanted to keep going, so I did so by myself. They wanted the pistol I had on me for safety reasons, leaving me to walk alone in the forest with water and nothing else. No big deal, I thought. I found a steep hillside with rocks all the way down when I was about 5 miles from camp and decided to go down. I followed the path at the bottom of this thing, which was at this point just a dry riverbed. I walked down, and it got steeper as I went further south. When I crossed a certain point, something just felt wrong. I started trying to look around for anything, but there was a huge log across the two hillsides, and when I crouched down to crawl under it, it felt like I was being watched. I looked up to my left and saw nothing. I looked around to see if there was anything in the middle of the riverbed, then looked up to the right. Huge black canine. It was too small to be a bear, but it looked like a wolf on steroids. That dog creature and I held glances for what felt like hours, but I know it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. Every passing moment made the feeling of dread worse. I moved backwards to get the hell out of there, and when I moved, the wolf thing just booked it into the forest, further from camp. In hindsight, this thing was moving faster than any dog I've ever seen. The walk back was eerie. It didn't feel as much as I was being watched, as there was just the feeling of it will catch me eventually. And that's why I don't ever hike alone anymore. Whistle monster. Earlier last year, I went hiking with a friend at night, maybe around 10 p.m., on a trail in the PNW of Washington, and this experience was brought up again, and I was hoping for some insight or answers. Around the peak of our nighttime hike, around 11:30 or midnight, while we were at the tallest point of the trail, things started to take a strange turn. We heard rustling in the trees and bushes nearby, but it was pretty flat at the top of the trail, so visibility was okay, so we just thought it was an animal, but then the animal started to whistle, and it started to get louder and closer. We did not stay to find out what it was, and we promptly left, running away and cutting through many private properties to get away from whatever whistling was chasing us away. These are private trails, and it was late at night, and where it started, as I stated before, it was pretty flat, so our visibility was okay, yet we couldn't see any beings of any sort, just the approach of inhuman whistling. I was living in a small rural town at the time. I would often go for late night walks, listening to music, to take my mind off of things. It was a warm summer night and very dark, there was not much light pollution there. When I made it to the fishing pond at the edge of town, I saw what can only be described as a translucent little old man who was dancing to the beat in my headphones. I remember laughing at first, thinking I must be crazy. I stopped walking and kneeled down to get eye level with it. It just stood there silently dancing, staring me in the eyes. It had a weird little grin on its face, like that of an old man. That's when I felt a fear that, to this day, I have never felt again. I just stood there for a while, staring, and finally it stopped moving. I had my phone flashlight on at this point, and shining in its direction, I could see the light retracting like it was being shown through a prism. I ducking ran at that point. I don't like thinking about it, I feel like if I do, it will find me. I know I sound crazy, but I've never told anyone about it, and I will never go back there again. About a month ago, I was hiking off trail during the day, enjoying the spring weather and listening to the wind blow through the leaves. Birds chirping, squirrels running across bark, jumping from limb to limb. As I ventured deeper into the forest, off trail, of course, everything seemed to just stop. Complete silence, no more birds, no more squirrels. I know silence in the woods is no good, so I start to examine my surroundings. As I do this, I get the feeling I am being watched, goosebumps from head to toe. Then I saw it. I wish I could say more than it, but I knew no name for the creature I saw. It was about 50 yards out on a ridge, staring at me. It was humanoid, but its skin was a very light gray pigment, it had long arms with claw-like hands, and it was large. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. It stood, staring at me. I was frozen with fear. Finally, after a few moments, without taking my eye off of the creature, I drew my pistol, never hike alone without one, and fired it into the air. When I did this, it retreated at a speed I have never seen any living creature move. I sat there for a good 30 minutes, pistol in hand, listening and scanning the environment. Finally, the birds started chirping again, the squirrels were back out, and everything seemed normal. I left and never looked back. A part of me wanted to go on the ridge to see its tracks, but I felt if I went in its direction, I wouldn't have returned. Never again will I go hiking in that forest. Just driving through it gives me an evil feeling, like the monster knows I'm there and is watching me. Does anyone possibly know what I could have seen? I was hiking the Appalachian Trail back in about 1980 or something. I'm from Virginia, it was around lunchtime, and I walked past this rough-looking man dressed like it was the 1890s-1910s, playing the banjo softly. He asked if I would like to take a rest at his fire. So I sat next to him to rest, and without looking at me, he said, "You don't belong here." I'm confused, so I say, "What?" They've been watching from the trees for a long time, so I look around and see nothing. He then says, "You be careful where you wander." I then got up and left. Fast forward to that night. I had my tent set up, and I'm in my bivy sack, hearing whispering noises. I thought I was just hearing things. I had a few drinks before bed. After a few minutes, I had enough, so I got out of the sack but not my tent. Listening to the trees, I hear something walking closer to my campsite. Now I'm really ducking terrified. So I grabbed my knife. I had a shotgun, but it was outside, leaning against a tree. I walk out of my tent to try to find my gun. As I do this, I hear it. This horrible ear-piercing screech from out in the distance. So, thinking that I am in danger, I grab my gun, sling it over my shoulder, and climb a tree, sitting up in the branches with my gun in hand. I then saw something in the trees. I didn't know what the hell it was, but it was big, white, and scary as all hell. So I say, "Oi, whatever the duck is out there, back the duck away and leave, or I will shoot you." I got no response from this thing, but then, ducking laughed. I was practically shitting myself, so I hopped out of the tree, grabbed my backpack and my bottle of Jack, and ran the duck out there. I didn't know what else to do, but it's safe to say I'm not going back to those woods without a rifle by my side. This happened in northeastern Oklahoma within the Cherokee Reservation around 2008, at the beginning of the fall. Myself and 8 other friends I went to school with had all met up at a friend's house to hang out for the night around a campfire and listen to music, etc. We are all about 15 or 16 years old. My friend had a trail that went maybe over a quarter of a mile into the woods, where it led to an open circle in the wooded area. There was a fire pit there with a single tree and another trail that led south from the opening, where we would be hanging out for the night. We sat around doing this and that bullshitting into the night, and may I remind you we are not partying? No booze, no smoke, nothing, just 9 of us out in the woods having a good time. It gets around 2:30 or 3, and things change. We are all having a good time, and my friend John gets up and heads to the entrance of that south trail at the edge of the cutout to take a piss. I just happened to look up from the fire and turned to look at and up from him in the trail. This gray figure stood in front of him, about 20 yards away. I asked him quietly if he saw it, and he looked up and came back to the fire with the rest of us. My eyes are locked on this guy standing in the dark. This thing is about 7 feet tall and gray, with a static, cloudy look to it. Its legs started about where the bottom of one's chest plate would be, long, lanky arms that lay down almost to where one's knees would be, and black, hollow eyes with no mouth or nose. All 9 of us are staring at this thing, and no one can move. Some started to cry, some kept their heads down, but I kept my eyes right on it. I looked at this thing while it stood there, looking right back at us. It moved horizontally to the right into the woods off the south trail, slowly moving around. It got to a part in the woods that, during the day, you could see was about a 7-foot rock wall. When it approached, it hovered over this wall with no struggle at all, and then it slowly backed off into the depths of the dark woods and faded away. We didn't leave that fire until the sun came up, and we got out of there as fast as we could. We didn't talk about that night for years after that. We kept it to ourselves, and I only told it to people who were close to me. 15 plus years later, I asked some of the people who were there if they remembered what happened and what we witnessed, and every one of them remembered exactly what it looked like and exactly what it did. 9 of us saw something in those woods that night, and it saw us as well. That's my story of a real encounter with something I cannot explain other than seeing it with my own eyes and having 8 other people with me who saw the same thing. Who knows what it was? So I was chilling at home, and my other friends were out hiking. I wasn't invited because I had college courses that day, but when they came back, they recited an experience for me. So my friends, including my best friend, Brandon, were hiking around Cherokee National Park, and before they knew it, the sun had set. Brandon was trying to get down to the second part of their trail faster, and he slid down the side of a hill. Little did he know, his pocket ripped and his phone fell out of his pocket. He didn't know until about 15 minutes later, when he went to text somebody and didn't find it. They were already back where they were at this point, but they used a snap map to see where his phone was. He ran back to get it, picked it up, and placed it securely in an unripped pocket. Until he heard a blood-curdling scream. He's had similar experiences, but not this close. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion until they distinctly yelled, "Help, over here." He walked up the incline and looked between the trees to see where the sound was coming from, and across the way he saw a man standing on a neighboring mountain. The scream stopped, and he just stared over at Brandon, an unmoving silhouette. This continued for a few seconds before Brandon's fight or flight suddenly kicked in, and he went with it and just started running as fast as he could back to the meeting grounds. He looked back once and recited to me that the eyes of whatever was chasing him were reflective and too big to be a mountain lion of sorts. He ran for about 8 minutes before he ran into 2 other friends that were on the trip, Caleb and Alex, and they were like, "Dude, what's wrong?" Brandon wastes no time explaining and tells them, "Just ducking run." And so, they did. They ran for another 10 minutes, and all the while the 3 of them exclaimed, they kept hearing screams, all in different tones of voice, male, female, etc. They finally got back, still feeling the chasing, and urged everybody to just get in the car. After that, they sped off and didn't look back. They still haven't gone back. To me, this sounds like a skinwalker encounter, but what do y'all think? Because I know since they're Navajo creatures they mostly reside in the Midwest areas, but I just don't know what else this could have been. We're in East Tennessee. I live the farthest out of all my friends, 25 minutes from the nearest town and walking distance from the Cherokee Park border. I live in rural northwest Arkansas. I was in the backseat of a car riding through the woods this past December when I saw it. It was very tall, and it was walking on all 4s, but its hind legs brought its rear up a good foot or so above its head. I would say it was about as tall as a person. It was very thin and bony, but it looked like it had grayish pale skin over its body. It was walking just behind the tree line on the side of the road. The car was going about 40 miles per hour on a straight road, so I had a few solid seconds of looking at this thing before we passed it, and I know it wasn't just an optical illusion. I saw the thing as clear as day. My family said it might be a deer with chronic wasting disease, but it was much taller than any deer I've ever seen, and its body wasn't shaped like a deer at all. It had a humanoid face that I can't really describe other than looking sort of like a small human head but with something wrong with it, like being sickly gray and emaciated. No antlers or anything, just a freaky face. Its mouth was hanging open, and it had solid black eyes. It was honestly terrifying, and it still has me pretty freaked out. I've been trying to figure out what it may have been, but I haven't found anyone who's seen something matching that description. My closest guess was that it might be a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I'll never forget the night of August 14, 2021. I was fishing the river with my friend in a suburb of Minneapolis/St. Paul, Minnesota. We loved coming to this public park to fish because it was quiet and there was a nice sand bar to fish from. This park had a Sioux burial mound about a half mile from our spot. After fishing for the better part of the day, we decided to leave at dusk. In order to get back to our vehicles, we had to take a trail through the woods, which was about a 5-minute walk. I put a clip-on light on the bill of my hat so we could see the trail. I remember when I first glanced ahead down the trail, I saw 2 circular white lights that I assumed were fireflies. Once we got further down the trail, we were closer to the area where I had seen the fireflies. It was then that I saw a pair of eyes that were either highly reflective of my light or glowing white. It wasn't long before I could make out a body. It had a very large white body on 4 legs, bigger than a wolf but unnaturally skinny. I couldn't make out any facial features because her eyes were so bright. I wanted to warn my friend, but all I could manage to say was, "There's something there." We had no choice but to proceed because this was the only way back to our vehicles. This thing just stared us down but didn't make a sound. My friend yelled at it to try to scare it away, but it didn't react at all. I yelled at it after she did, and it responded back, mimicking my voice. I honestly questioned myself and thought I was imagining things. So I yelled at it again, and it responded back at the same volume and pitch, exactly like my voice. At this point, we realized this was not an animal. We both continued on the path in silence, but I maintained eye contact with the creature. I felt like this thing was ready to attack us at any moment, but it just stood there, staring. Eventually, we were out of the woods, and I could no longer see its eyes. We made it back to our vehicles and felt a sense of relief. I asked my friend, "Did you hear that talk back to me?" She said she did, and it sounded like my voice when it reverted back to us. If she hadn't heard the voice, I would have assumed I had imagined it. We went over what happened, and our stories were the same except she said the creature had a wolf-like head. After our experience, my friend, who is Hmong, went to see a shaman. The shaman believed it was an evil spirit and performed a cleansing on her. She was still shaken up by the experience for several weeks. I tried to hire a spiritual advisor online, but when I described the experience and asked for a spiritual cleansing of my own, it said they were not available at this time. At the advice of one of my friends, I burned some tobacco and said a prayer that the entity would leave me alone. It took me several months to just feel normal again, but I still think about it on a weekly basis. I tried to do further research and contacted the management at the park. They said the park we went to had ancient Indian remains scattered along the river that were unmarked. They said there were more Indian remains in that park than in any other parks they managed. I contacted several Native American friends and was told the entity we encountered was a skinwalker. I know skinwalkers are part of the Navajo culture, but from what I read, they check more of the boxes than any other supernatural being or cryptid. On Friday, I left work at lunchtime to go for an overnight bushwalk to a remote campsite in a national park that is about 60 kilometers from my work in Canberra. I decided not to take a tent as I was planning to sleep in a hut that has a fireplace, as it's still winter here. This hut is about a 2-kilometer walk from any fire trails and can only be reached by walking along a narrow foot track that climbs a hill for about 45 minutes. The hut only gets a handful of visitors each year due to how difficult it is to find and reach. My car was the only one in the car park, and I never passed anyone else on the way. There's only one track in and out of this place. When it got dark, I started a fire in the fireplace and had my dinner. I was tired and decided to go to sleep around 8:30 p.m., as I planned to get up early to walk back to my car early this morning. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a loud machine, really loud, like being directly under a helicopter or something. When I peered through the hut's window, I could see bright lights flashing around, lighting up the trees, but I couldn't see the source of the lights, which made me think that they were above me. There was no way I was going outside to investigate, so I just sat on a camp chair, wondering what the heck was outside. After a few minutes, both the sound and the lights stopped suddenly, like they had never been there. There was nowhere for anything to land nearby, as the hut is in a heavily treed area. After a few minutes, I got the courage to go outside with my head torch, and all I could see was some grass that had been slightly burned around the hut. Nothing else seems to have been damaged or disturbed. I stayed up for the remainder of the night and left for my car just before daylight came. There's no way that a vehicle could get to the hut, and I don't think that search and rescue would have a helicopter up at night in such a remote area, and there's no Air Force base nearby either. The national park doesn't allow hunters, so I really have no idea what it was or what was going on. I don't drink or use drugs, and I'm not taking any medication that could alter my perception. Any ideas what this could have been? Has anyone else had a similar unexplained encounter, particularly around Canberra and Australia? My wife and I were camping in a campground near Acadia National Forest. We realized the last night at the campground that there was an old family cemetery on the property near the tent sites. Later that night, after walking the dogs, we walked in that direction, listening to necrophonic on earbuds. As we got closer to the cemetery, the app became more active, with fewer pauses between words. It was not like other times we have had the app running. My wife walked over towards the gravestones to read some dates. While reading dates, she said, "If we are disturbing you, tell us, and we will leave." Then very clearly, a deeper voice on necrophonic said, "Leave." We apologized and left the area. The only other experiences that have seemed like there was communication through the necrophonic app were when we were introduced to the app in Gettysburg by a ghost hunting group. But those experiences were not as clear and direct as that night in Maine. So, for starters, I live in a very secluded area. We have neighbors, but there is plenty of space between us. A good horse pasture or two. You can't really hear each other from that distance unless you're being very loud. Even then, you can't hear them well. Tonight I was walking my dog and misjudged the time a little. It was dark, but he needed to get on with his business. I turned on my flashlight and told him to stay close. I verbally expressed to him, yes, to my dog, that it was dark and I didn't want to walk far. I shook off my worry and decided to go a little further than I would have liked. I have always been scared of the dark. It bothers me sometimes more than others. At this point, we are far enough from the house that I can only see around me with the flashlight. I have my house in view, but the porch light is very old and doesn't span out over the yard. I don't come out this far at night unless my husband is with me. When Buddy began to head back, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was a bird in a tree nearby. I stood there for a second to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. When I looked around, it grew louder. I'm obviously uneasy at this point. The reality of how far away from home we are begins to set in. I start walking toward Buddy so that we can make our way back. That's when the sound grows closer. It takes me back for a second. It sounds almost like a flock of birds, though not actually. It's as if someone was playing the sound of birds on a tape recorder. I glance over to my dog, and he is looking toward the sound with his head tilted to the side. I look at where he's facing and notice it's in the deepest part of the woods on our property. I tell Buddy that it's time to go inside. I didn't hide the panic in my voice. That's when the sound seemed to pick up pace and grow even closer. I run as fast as I can to the house. Buddy, thankfully, knows that if Mom is running, then he should too. We got to the house fine. The sound only faded as we got to the fence. Buddy was very alert for the next couple minutes and wouldn't leave my side. I've tried to calm myself down by considering that my neighbors have chickens. The thing is that the only neighbor that has them doesn't live on that end of the wood line, no one does. Not for a few miles. It is just open land there. By some chance that this sounds crazy and you think that it was probably just birds, I do too, honestly. You first have to understand that my parents are farmers. They have many types of birds, chickens, guinea pigs, ducks, turkeys, parrots, inside pets, etc., so I would have been able to identify them very well. If you can take anything from this, please avoid going outside alone at night, with a bad flashlight, and unarmed. I hope it was a good, spooky story for you. One day last year, I was hunting from a ground blind on the edge of a field near a small stream. On the other end of the creek is a densely wooded area that goes straight uphill for about 100 yards, we call this area the thicket. This property is located roughly 2 hours northeast of Atlanta, Georgia. It was a cool and overcast morning with very light misty rain. It had been uneventful up to this point, as there had been no animal activity all morning. Roughly 30 minutes into my sit, I hear something walking down the hill from the thicket at about 4 o'clock. I assume it's a deer, as I can tell by the footfalls that it's a sizable animal, and there's really no other medium to large-sized animals around here. It gets to the edge of the water, probably about 30 or so yards from me, and stops. The back windows on my blind are closed so as not to silhouette myself from the front, so I can't see anything. It's been quiet for a minute. Then, I felt something very small hit the roof of the blind. I'm under a tree, so I don't think much of it could have been an acorn. But about 30 seconds later, I feel another impact, this one still near the top but on the side of the blind. This occurrence leads me to the conclusion that something didn't just fall on my blind. Something was thrown at it. Thoughts are starting to enter my mind. What the hell could be out here throwing rocks at my blind? Why, even? I didn't have much time to think about other thoughts before this thing stepped into the creek with a resounding splash. As it takes its time stomping around in the creek, curiosity gets the better of me, and I decide to slowly stand up, open the side flap of the blind, and see what's been causing me so much grief. Nothing. Not in the creek, the field, the trees, nowhere. I sit back down and try to wrap my head around what the hell is going on. But after only about 30 seconds, it all starts right back up, but in addition to the water treading, it's now making the occasional soft vocalization, sort of a grunting type sound. This thing now has my full attention. When I hunt, I usually carry 3 things with me: a hunting knife, a 9mm pistol, and my primary hunting rifle, a Browning X bolt chambered in 300 short magnums. If you don't know what any of that means, the short version is that it's a very powerful rifle with a massive bullet. To this day, I've never had a deer run away and bleed out somewhere with this gun. They're always dead before they hit the ground, usually from blunt force trauma. The reason I tell you this is to highlight the fact that, at the time, I wasn't exactly defenseless, quite the opposite. And as the noises from just on the other side of the mesh continued to escalate, I came to the conclusion that my only way out of this encounter was confrontation. I stand up, unzip the blind, and step out into the open field, take the safety off my shoulder cannon, and turn towards the creek to face my assailant. I don't know what I expected to see, but what I saw next was nothing. Again. No, that's impossible, I thought aloud. He was right there. What the hell is going on? I don't care how much heat I'm packing at this point, nothing that big and heavy can just vanish into thin air without so much as making a sound. It's time to get the hell out of there, and now. My RTV was parked about 150 yards away on the other side of the field, and then it was about half a mile back to the house. But as I turn to make good on my retreat, I can't even take one step before I hear it. A grunt. And then heavy footfalls. I turn to see nothing, but I can hear it still walking slowly back up into the thicket. And this time, I swear, I can hear it breathing. I haven't hunted that field again, nor do I plan to. To this day, my partner refuses to talk about an encounter we shared at Yosemite National Park last year. It was a beautiful sunny day in August or September of last year when we decided to go on a hike through Yosemite. I had been there once before, but we drove most of the time through the park since it was getting dark when we arrived and only pulled over to take photos of Half Dome and grab snacks. This time was very different. We knew we were going to go on a very long hike, but we did not bring much with us. We had water, snacks, a little backpack, and some ganja. Well, about 3 hours into our hike, it was maybe 2 p.m. we were walking from a very wide open space near a creek and into a more wooded area when the sky turned from a sunny day to a strange dark tint. For a brief 8 seconds, the entire surrounding area felt like a dream. The wind began circling on the forest floor, moving leaves in various directions, and the sunlight that was on us all day, even through dense trees, disappeared. It was almost like we both went from day to night, and the temperature dropped dramatically. It became very cold. We both turned to each other and began walking very fast because we felt a strange energy, and as I leaned up against a rock and my partner's eyes were on the trail, I looked behind him and saw a baby bear frolicking near 3 large stones. The leaves around it were moving in circles, and the bear was jumping up and down, playing. My dog, who normally would bark at being so alarmed at any other animals that size, was completely silent, almost like it didn't see anything in front of it. I became frozen in fear and hit my partner's shoulder to turn him around when he saw the bear. I told him that if baby was there, mama must be close by. We haven't seen anybody walk toward us for miles, and we were terrified because if we were to scream for help, nobody would hear. We were ill-equipped. We turned around and saw a hiker a half a mile down the way, where we told him what happened. He had a lot of photo equipment and seemed to be searching for something. Little did I know he didn't want to turn around and walk with us, he wanted to go toward the bear. We followed him back up the trail because we were already hours into our hike and didn't want to turn around, but we never saw the bear again. The sun was out like normal, and the temperature was back to warm. I think about this experience all the time. It was different than any other experience encountering a bear I have ever heard about in Yosemite. The sky literally changed. The wind became strong. And we saw a bear playing with the wind and leaves as if we weren't there. I had no reason to fear the bear or the sky changing from day to night for a few seconds, but to this day, I wonder why I felt fear. I was told later that I must have encountered a spirit of the forest. This incident happened in 1963 in Ucluelet, BC. I was 22 and on my honeymoon when I saw a creature, what I would later call a Bigfoot. I saw it in the clear light of day, free of any obstruction, and I have thought about it every day since. My husband and I were camping in the Broken Islands. It was early June, and the weather was beautiful. It was about 7 in the evening, and I walked to the edge of the water and began to wade out. The water came up to just below my shorts. I stood there and admired the beauty. The sun had not started to set, and there was a peaceful stillness at that moment. My husband was asleep in the tent, and I thought to wake him so we could cook dinner together. I turned back toward the beach, and it was standing there motionless. I didn't hear it make a sound. The beachhead was gravel and rocks that crunched and clicked as we moved around, but I didn't hear this thing at all. I couldn't understand what I was looking at and just stood frozen. My eyes were going all over its body, trying to comprehend. I thought it was a naked man. It was taller than me by a wide margin. I was 5 feet 8 inches, and this was probably over a foot taller. It was lean and lanky, like a basketball player. It hunched at the shoulders and had long arms that hung at its sides in a non-threatening manner. It had long fingers with black nails. It stood with its legs close together. It had long feet, just like its hands and fingers. It had a potbelly, and a thin thing hung down. It had a round head, and the face looked like a person, but different, something off. The body was covered in a brownish hair layer, but its outline was still visible. The hair stuck up like an orangutan. The skin on the hands, feet, and face was visible and grayish. Dusty and ashy looking. Its eyes were black, and I couldn't see any other color. We just stood there, looking at each other. I was stunned, and he was indifferent. He never looked away, but he had an expression of indifference. I said hello in a broken half-whisper. I couldn't think of what else to do. He smiled at me, his lips peeled back, revealing large teeth, like a horse's teeth. They looked too big and square for the mouth. When I looked at it in the face and the eyes, at that moment, I realized this was not a person. It was like a person, but it was something different. A wave of nausea overtook me. I began to vomit and felt faint. The world started to spin. I moved towards the shore and fell on my hands and knees. I heaved with such force into the dirt that I also defecated myself. The spinning stopped, and I sat up. He was gone. I was there on my knees and just kept replaying the incident in my head for, I don't know, how long. I stripped my clothes off and cleaned myself in the water. The sun was beginning to set, and I got dressed and lay next to my husband. I don't remember sleeping, just fever, chills, and dizziness. We left the next day. I never told my husband what I saw. We split up 5 years later. I live in Texas. I've remarried, had children and grandchildren, divorced again, and remarried. I never told a soul about what I saw. I would go to the library and look for books about monsters. I was trying to understand what it was, the thing I saw. Bigfoot became popular in the late 1960s and 1970s. I saw the infamous PGF footage. That's not like what I saw, what I stood staring at, or what changed me forever. I came from a typical Texas, all-American family. I wasn't supposed to see this. Now I'm someone with a secret. Something I could never talk about in my real life. My interest in this subject has been a complete secret. No one who knows me would ever guess. I have never said this out loud. I saw a Bigfoot in 1963. A few months ago, me, 16, my sibling, 12, and my friends D, 16, C, 13, and L, 24, were on a hiking trail a few miles from our house. The trail is 9 miles long, with heavy woods surrounding the entirety of it. When you walk about a quarter of the trail, there's a bend where you can take a seat and look at the river. There's a small bench and a book people can leave messages in. We had walked to the bend and taken a quick break. By the time we got there, the sun had started to set. You could hear the bugs all around you and hear the wildlife in the trees and bushes. After a few minutes, we continued walking and made our way to the other side of the trail, where there's a clearing. We walked down the dirt trail. On both sides, there's a ditch full of tall grass, nearly 4 feet tall. About 100 feet from the trail are the woods we just came out of, and on the other side, there's also wood on private property. We keep waking up down the trail, and we get about 50 feet from the clearing when we all hear a man screaming from inside the woods. At first, we couldn't make out what he had screamed, we just knew we had all heard it. We all stopped dead in our tracks and looked between each other, trying to figure out what he screamed. Immediately after C says, "What was that?" we hear the man scream again. This time, it was very clear. We hear the man screaming, "Help! Help me! Help!" At this point, we have no idea who this man is, where he was, or if he was even a man. A few seconds go by, and L yells back out to the man, "Hello? Do you need help?" We get no response. We stared at each other in disbelief for about a minute, wondering what to do. We discussed the possibilities of what it could be, wondering if it really was a man crying out for help or if it was something else. We decided to keep walking down the trail after it was silent for a few minutes. We didn't hear any more screams or yells, but we did hear heavy footsteps in the woods, something that wasn't human. On the walk out of the trail, we took pictures of the trees and caught a pair of glowing eyes in a few pictures. We know these were not lighting bugs as they were all lower to the ground. The eyes were an orange-red color and far back, peeking between the trees near us. We took pictures every few feet, and there would be the same eyes following along with us. When we were near the end of the trail, we heard the same male voice screaming something we couldn't understand. Nothing else happened on that trail, and we haven't gone back since. I decided to hike the AT for my first overnight weekend backpack trip. The plan was to go shelter. It was late November, the trees were bare, there was no foliage, and you could see a good way into the tree line. I saw deer, a black bear, a raccoon, and a squirrel, and my favorite moment was sharing my apple and trail mix with chipmunks. I'd never seen one, and they came right up to me at Len Foot Hike Inn, a small hostel in the middle of the forest. It was refreshing, the sounds of the forest in my ears and the breeze on my face. I started on the approach trail at Amicalola Falls, heading northbound to the southern terminus, Springer Mountain. It was 4 shelters, all about 8 to 10 miles apart, and it took most of the day to travel from one to the next. On the second morning, at the Springer Mountain shelter, everything had a layer of ice on it when I woke up, The temperature was 17 degrees and everything was frozen. I attempted to make coffee, but it was futile, it was too cold, and I couldn't get the lighter to work to light my propane stove. I packed everything up and headed to Hawk Mount Shelter. As the sun breaks the horizon, it begins to warm up. The sky was clear, and the sun was beaming, but the woods were eerie. I'd assumed it was from the cold start, but it had warmed up to 45 degrees at this point. I didn't hear any animal noises, and the forest was silent. The previous day, birds chirped, I heard small animals rustling in the layer of fallen leaves, and I watched a deer bound off when it saw me. As I got closer to the shelter, I remember having this irrational fear come over me. Once I reached it, I unpacked and set up my area inside. It had access to water, and I had gone to fill my bottles to prep for dinner. The site's water source was a few hundred feet down a hill behind the shelter. While I was down there, I had this weird fear while refilling my bottles that I was being watched. I kept my head on a swivel, watching the surrounding tree line, and kept thinking something might pop out at any second. Then, a few moments later, I heard something big rustle in the tree line. My heart was thumping in my chest. I grabbed my water and sped back to the shelter. A little later, 2 guys I'd seen hiking earlier showed up, and we made small talk. They unpacked and set up their areas in the shelter as well. We all pitched in, collected firewood, started a fire, and sat around making small talk while eating our dinners. As night began to fall, a loud pop came from something hitting the shelter. I checked the trees but didn't see anything that might have fallen. I shrugged it off, continuing to chat with the guys at the fire. A bit later, another loud pop came from the shelter. We discussed what it could be and rationalized that it must be something falling from the trees. I was skeptical. Personally, I didn't think anything falling from a tree could have caused that loud of a noise. It happened a few more times as dusk became night. After an hour, we call it a night, get into the shelter, and head to bed. After a few minutes, another loud pop came from the back wall of the shelter, and we brushed it off again. After a bit, I passed out. I had to get up and relieve myself. It was so cold that I recall climbing back into my mummy bag and using my breath to warm myself back up. I fell back asleep fairly quickly, and it felt as though I'd just closed my eyes when I was jolted awake by what I can only describe as a lion's roar or human screaming lasting 10 seconds that echoed through the woods. It was extremely loud. We were all sitting up in our bags, asking each other, what the hell was that? Terrified, we grabbed our weapons, loaded the chamber, and sat there for what felt like an eternity. I'd never been so afraid in my life. We made a plan for what to do if something happened, but nothing ever happened. Then what sounds like a tank began running through the trees. It tore through trees, footsteps thumping with each step. Slowly, it became clear that it was leaving. As the sound was moving away, I'd never been so relieved. Eventually, we fell back asleep when the adrenaline wore off. The next day, I looked around the shelter for any possible signs of what it was. I can't guarantee it, but there were a few ping-pong ball-sized rocks at the back of the shelter that looked out of place. The rest were partially buried. I also found a set of rocks that were arranged from largest to smallest in a straight line a little farther back, between the shelter and the water source. I don't know what that thing was, but it was definitely a very strange night. The rest of the trip was mostly uneventful. The woods went back to being filled with sounds, and the strange, ominous feeling for the next half of the trip had disappeared. The only strange thing that happened that could have been night hikers with headlamps on was a handful of spook-light-looking orbs in the woods, about a quarter mile from the last shelter that weekend. There were 4 at first, and over a period of 3 to 4 hours, they multiplied to about 10. I never saw this happen, but every time I looked, there were a couple more before I went to bed on the last night. Otherwise, I made it out of the woods that weekend, slightly changed and intrigued by what I'd experienced, but never, so far, to experience anything like this in the woods again. My girlfriend and I were camping in a nice place right next to the Blue River in the White Mountains of Arizona on Saturday, September 9th. We were getting ready to go to bed when, at about 9 p.m., we heard this profoundly human-like, pitch whisper noise. It would raise up and down in pitch in perfect rhythm. About 1 second of raised pitch, 1 second of lowered pitch, then, 2 seconds of silence, repeat. The whistle only happened a total of 4 times before it suddenly disappeared. Not only did the whistle change pitch, but it also moved. 1 second, it was far from the campsite and harder to hear, and then the next, it was like 40 feet from the tent. I looked on the internet and found no real explanation. Also, there wasn't anyone else near us, and the closest that other people would have been was about a mile away, and there was no wind all night. I hope someone on here has some kind of information on what I heard and experienced. Thoughts on what it could be? The story is from 2 years ago, when I was 18, 2021. It was a partly cloudy day, and I was going to go for a walk in the forest like every day. The main path of the forest crosses from behind our house, so it wasn't like a long walk, but it was just deep in the forest, a dirt road with trees around you as far as the eye can see. It was kind of late compared to usual. It was around 5:30 or 6 p.m., and it was getting dark, but because I was familiar with the path, I wasn't worried, and thinking I would be back soon made me just go for it. I was about 20 minutes into the walk, and it just kept getting darker every minute. I got to a part of the path that is straight, like 1,000 feet, and you can see the end of it, and as I was slowly walking on that road like dusk, I wasn't sure what I was looking at, especially in that distance. My first thought was that it's probably a cow. It's a village, so many people have farms around here, and sometimes they let their cows in the woods for days, but in like a large group, but I thought then why this one is alone, and most importantly, why it's not moving. Believe it or not, I don't know why, but I didn't stop. It was the curiosity, maybe, or I just didn't want to be a pussycat if it's a prank or some guy from the village. I don't really know what I was thinking in that moment. I just remember looking at the thing without a blink as I was walking towards it. The thing that creeped me out the most was why the hell this thing doesn't move an inch. I was just getting more and more scared as I got closer to it. I started to see a shape. It was a tall figure with long and skinny legs. At one point, I think I saw a third leg or maybe a stick in his hands. I don't know exactly, it was so blurry. I kept walking, and, still not knowing what I was looking at, my heart was just coming out of my mouth. I stopped at maybe 60 feet of the figure, just looking at it, it was just coming out of my mouth. I stopped at maybe 60 feet of the figure, just looking at it standing still without a single move or anything. I didn't have the courage to say anything. I remember just thinking, duck it. I turned around and walked away. As I was walking back, I constantly looked back at my shoulder, paranoid of seeing that thing move, but every time it was just standing there and just kept getting further away and finally out of sight. It was almost completely dark at this point. After a few turns, I calmed down a little bit. I wasn't worried that much. I didn't run home like crazy, keep walking normally, and try not to think about what just happened. I just started working with my phone to maybe call a friend to just talk with them until I got home. And just before that, for the last time, I looked back, something I wish I had never done. I saw something that traumatized me for life and still makes my hand shake from fear to this day. I saw the same blurred black figure, standing still, in the middle of the road, looking at me from like 50 feet. I didn't stand there to see if it moved or not this time. I just ran for my life. I ran like if I stopped, I would die. I didn't look at my back, I just ran home. When I got home, my hands and feet were shaking, something that I had never experienced and that I hope I never do again. My family was worried too. After I told them what just happened, they told me I was hallucinating, but I could tell from their eyes that they were shocked and scared. I never experienced such a thing again and never mentioned it with anyone until today, but this experience will forever be in my mind and haunt me forever. This took place in mid-July this past year in Okemah, Oklahoma. My boyfriend and I live in the Edmond/OKC area, but we had come down to Okemah with a few friends for the annual Woodyfest Music Festival to celebrate Woody Guthrie. The day was pretty normal. We unpacked our tent from my Xterra. It was a small 2-person tent, and it looked silly next to the giant 10-person tent our friends were staying in. We were camping out in this giant, wide-open field. Near the desolate road, there was a small house erected with showers and a pool behind it. The rest of the field was filled with tents. I called my mother to check in with her because I missed a call from her while driving, and we continued to unpack our stuff, cooler, guitars, etc. The camping spots were pretty spread out except for ours because we shared a camping spot with our friends, so we almost literally shared a tent wall with them. Anyhow, into the night we go. We attend the festival in a neighboring field and come back to the tents around 12:30 a.m., chat with our friends in the other tent, and then head back to ours to go to sleep. I wake up for apparently no reason at around 4:15 a.m. Most of the campground is quiet, though I can hear singing and guitar being played a fair distance behind us. The way our tent was set up, facing west from the back of the tent, was the whole of the campground. We were a bit on the outskirts. Facing east from the front of the tent was a wide open field with an overgrown fence and a barbed wire fence, maybe 100 feet away from us. I'm awake, trying to go back to sleep, when I hear something calling my name. It sounds far away, but it also sounds as if it were right in my ear. I had no idea where the sound was coming from at first. Upon further inspection, the voice seemed to be coming from the field facing the front of the tent. I honestly have no idea how I came to this conclusion. Initially, I passed it off as maybe being sleep deprived or possibly having sleep paralysis. I don't have a history of sleep paralysis, but I genuinely have no idea what this was. I turned to look at my boyfriend, who was sleeping soundly, and about 30 seconds later, I hear my name being called again. But this time, the thing is asking me to come to it. I finally figured out what it sounds like. The voice sounds almost like my mother's voice, but it's not quite right. There is an undertone to it that I can't pinpoint, but it just doesn't sound like my mother. I feel cold, vulnerable, and terrified, rather than under the warm and protective aura of my mother. I instantly freeze. I cannot move a muscle. I am sitting upright in the tent now, just frozen. I can't move or make a sound to wake up my boyfriend. I just sit and listen. I still can't exactly figure out where the sound is coming from, as it switches between the field and right in my ear. This goes on for 30 minutes. The only parts of my body that I could move were my eyes. My boyfriend has a calculator watch on his left arm that he had dangling out of his sleeping bag, and I could barely see the clock from my outmost peripheral vision. It called my name and asked me to come to it for a half hour. Then it stopped as quickly as it had begun. I still didn't move a muscle. Eventually, after about 15 minutes of silence, I laid back down. I took this time to note that all of the cicadas had stopped chirping. There were no bugs, no frogs, no birds, nothing. Not even the guitar was playing anymore. I suddenly hear the voice again, but it sounds like it is coming from right outside the tent, although it is still far away. This time, the voice is demanding that I come to it and demanding that I come out now. I lay frozen on the ground as this went on for another 15 minutes. Then it stops. I fall back asleep almost immediately, practically on top of my boyfriend. I didn't hear the voice again for the rest of the night. I didn't mention it until months later. I woke up and convinced myself that it was probably just a dream. But I'm not so sure. After learning more about the paranormal and talking about it with my friends, I am almost 100% sure that I had an encounter with a skinwalker. It was a new year, the last one to come. Me and my friends ventured into a park around 1 a.m., as there were cops on the road and we didn't want to get done drinking or smoking. We head pretty far in and hide behind a big fallen tree, setting up our picnic rug. We hang there for a little while until everything gets really quiet. Like dead silence, there were still people further up the road at the lookout we came from, but we couldn't hear them anymore. There was just no noise. My friend points out that he can hear a sort of whistling in the trees, almost of a human sort. When I listen in, I can hear it too. It almost sounds like a human whistling to another human, a few whistles first, and then a response. Not musical whistles either, it almost seemed more like communication. At this point, we decide to leave. All of us are getting weird vibes. I should mention there were about 5 of us this night. We decide to cut further into the park to get back to the main road at the bottom. It's not a big park at all, maybe 2 kilometers in length. So we know we can reach the road in no time, especially as we are near the bottom. But as we get further down, it becomes apparent that we are lost. We try to follow the path, but it is not maintained. There is lots and lots of tall grass, making everything confusing. We try a few offshoots of the path, but not one of them leads to the tourist road as they are all overgrown. We see a bus stop down the hill, but decide to keep trekking as we can see it's down a nasty embankment. We are catching our breath and starting off again when me and my friend call him. Baz hears a blood-curdling scream from the trees ahead. It sounds almost like a woman or a little girl screaming at full pelt, but has a strange sort of recorded quality. It's almost as if you heard it through a speaker or from really far away. Strangely, it sounded close, though. Everyone freezes and looks at me, and I just say it was a possum. I have lived in this particular area of the hills for my whole life, essentially, and have done many night walks. Not once have I heard a possum or an owl make that noise. We continue looking for a way out with no luck, with an increasing feeling of dread and fear creeping into our minds. The darkness is thick. Like thicker than it should be. The moon was almost full and there was a lot of light that night, but this park seemed extra dark, despite it actually being very open. At this point, we are all at our wits' end. We follow a path, and we can see the road now, but in our path is the largest holly bush I have ever seen, just rife with spikes. We go back yet again to where we started, and my partner gives me his walking stick for getting through brush. I immediately flip it around and hold it like a bat. We wander a few more steps, and like a miracle, a car drives past, illuminating the bus stop, clearly less than 10 meters from us. We practically run out of the bush, scrambling down the embankment, and speed walking home. It's worth mentioning that I have since researched Australian nocturnal animals, particularly those in the Dandenong Ranges, and am yet to find anything that sounded even close to what we heard. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what was in the bushes. It didn't help that my friend made a skinwalker joke when we first heard the whistling either. I have adapted a habit of denying or outright ignoring the many creepy things that have happened around me in my life. I'm at heart a skeptic, but I cannot deny the feeling of something unnatural. I have been working a lot and have been a little down, so my fiancé and I planned an all-day hike or adventure to climb to a mountain peak. It's a part of our getting healthy goals, so we did not do this often. It was a 37-mile trip, most of it on bikes, but most of the elevation was gained on foot. The first strange thing I noticed was the number of cars at the trailhead. 10 or more cars. The whole trip, we only saw 2 people. For some reason, it seemed weird to me from the start, before we knew how empty the there and back trail was. We only saw the 2 people right before a little bit of a storm passed and an hour in. We waited for it to pass before we attempted to go higher. At this point, I was starting to get very tired, but I wanted to keep going. 2,000 feet of elevation on foot by now. The people were strange, they kept looking at the ground and passed without acknowledging us, even though we said hi. Later on, the fiancé stopped and asked if I heard those strange sounds too. We lightly joked about aliens but agreed it couldn't have been thunder or aircraft. It sounded like a mix between slow, deep drums and mechanical wind. Robot crickets? There were not many bugs or frogs up here, so that was weird. We then heard voices. Or I did. More than one. Laughter. Again, we did not see any other people on this trail, so this didn't become weird until later. We then got lost and ended up at a small pond. A trail led to the back with bones, so many animal bones. More than 5 or 6 big elk or deer skeletons. I remember standing and looking at them, the fiancé visibly unnerved, with me trying to back away from what we stumbled into. At this point, I started to want to go home, but we were so close. After we left the bones and found the trail again, the fiancé brought up the silence. It was profound. When he acknowledged it, I stopped and looked around. The tension immediately rose, so I stopped, ignored it, and tried to change the subject. There wasn't even wind, which felt unnatural given all the strange sounds up until that point. We make it almost to the top and eat the last of the food. Which is scary because I thought I packed more than enough. I'm hypoglycemic. The fiancé is nervous because he's too tired to carry me if I pass out. We make a plan to leave me behind, and he runs for help. If we take too long to come down, we don't think we'll get lost or have to take so many breaks. So we start our way back. The silence had gone on for a long time. We both feel an urgency to leave the real situation and the unreal, unnatural vibes around us. I cannot express how everything just seemed off. I started trying to run downhill, and the fiancé kept trying to have me take breaks. Then I saw it. Off trail ahead of us several yards, I saw what clearly looked like a person standing up from a low position. Now, I couldn't see it clearly, as I wasn't looking directly at it at first. It moved like it had to push itself up with its upper body or an arm, stood up off of it, looked at me, and then shuffled back and forth as if on 2 feet. My fiancé must have heard some sound from me, because he turned around, looked at my face, and then looked where I was looking. He reached for me, and I felt him freeze when he saw it. Once I was looking at it, it just looked like a dark figure through several trees. Then it turned and dropped down on all 4s. We moved when it moved to get a better glimpse. After a few steps and fewer trees, we saw a deer running very slowly through the trees. We watched until it was gone, but I cannot describe the horror I felt at the unreal speed. It seemed so fast when I couldn't see it clearly, but so slow when I could. Like the legs were moving faster than they were? Ike. Even the fiancé doubted that was the thing we saw. Maybe there were 2 deer? Surely it would be gone in a flash and not still around for us to see it was, in fact, a deer? Right? We had already been basically running down the mountain, but this time he doesn't ask if I want another break. It was almost dark when we noticed 2 cars still parked at the trailhead. Again, no campsites or other people were sighted at dusk coming down. We made it to some food quick enough that it wasn't a disaster. However, I'm still playing scenarios of if I fell and hurt myself while running downhill while exhausted. I did fall twice, but what if I couldn't get back up? Then I would have to wait in those woods with whatever that was while he went for help. I really hope this wasn't a skinwalker and was just a trick of the eyes. It was easier to believe it wasn't until I remembered how scared he was and how he asked me exactly what I saw. I haven't told him it looked like it moved like a human at first. I said huge dark figure getting up, but I usually downplay this stuff in the moment and reflect later. I really hope this doesn't stir the proverbial skinwalker spot, but weird things still happen even if I don't talk about them, so I figured, why not? What do you guys think? Last night, I was skiing and camping out of my RV in an unofficial secret spot. High in the Sierra Nevadas of California, the location was right next to one of the most imposing peaks of the area, at the base of which was a frozen lake and a resort closed for the season. Sparse trees surrounded the lake, and a pillowy fog hung over the icy expanse at dawn and dusk. Obscured by banks of snow from the adjacent highway, plow drivers had only bothered to clear a small portion of the road into this resort. It was the perfect place to hide out for a few nights. As soon as I tucked into bed, I started to hear the strange noises again. This time, they wouldn't stop. From the absolute darkness and the otherwise total silence of a blanket of snow, I heard something moving, not human footsteps. It sounded like 2 snow shovels piercing the ground. Quietly, but quickly, it traveled. Through my open windows, I suddenly felt an intense feeling of being watched. The entity came from a path that was covered in 3 feet of powder. The noises got louder until they were right up to the side of my window. Terrified and afraid to make a sound, I lay in bed, watching and listening. Only a thin bug screen separated me from this creature in the pitch-black darkness. On a night with not even a breath of wind to cause the sensation, I felt my RV pitch from side to side. It had climbed to the top. As it clambered about, I heard the now familiar noise of the night's frozen dew cracking under its weight. I could hear the ice fragments shed off the edges of my home and burst upon hitting the ground. I say familiar because I have heard these noises before. On the first night, ice also fell with the sound of footsteps and the shaking of the RV. Thinking it was a person up to no good, I charged outside with a flashlight and a knife. After all, the paranormal usually has a logical explanation. Examining the site carefully, there wasn't so much as a new print in the snow. I was satisfied, and with the noises gone, I slept unperturbed. The second night, my brother slept in the room. I heard the ice crack again, but no more. Neither compared to this third night. Judging from the amount of rock the RV rocked as the entity moved, it was lightweight and agile. It was clever enough to completely stop moving as a car from the highway approached, long before lights would dimly illuminate the campsite. It watched me even when it stopped. It climbed down from the roof. I could hear its snow shovel feet crunching into the ground as it began to pace around my camper. The creature alternated between the roof and the sides. I realized it was looking for a way in. Breaking free of my petrification, I gently rolled over in bed and shut the 2 windows next to my head, covering them with blinds. It noticed. I immediately heard the shoveling retreat. But it didn't leave. Straining my ears, I could tell it was pacing about 30 yards away. Even though there was no wind, what sounded like a metal sign clanging against a tree persisted. I tiptoed to my knife and clutched it against me. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep. I had a pleasant dream about my grandparents. At the end, it changed. I was on the couch in the camper, and from a roof vent above me, a dark ooze draped into my space. Gathering my courage, I unsheathed my knife and thrust at the shape with a shout. To my surprise, I was still in bed, my knife was sheathed, and I had just stabbed a guitar. Still, it was too topically relevant of a dream. I wanted to stay and sleep, but I wanted to not be cursed by this entity even more. I brandished my knife and headlamp, bursting out of my door. My light whipped wildly about, looking for any evidence of the creature that had visited. Nothing. No footsteps. No roof ice shattered on the ground. No metal sign is attached to any tree for clanging. I jumped into the driver's seat and got out of there. I slept at a nearby populated campsite until dawn. Not a single noise, even with the windows wide open. What was that thing? What did it want? Surely there must be a physical explanation in this scientific age we live in, but after what I experienced, I'm not so sure. This happened in 2019. I had always been an avid hiker, and when I heard about the beautiful trails in the Swiss Alps, I knew I had to go. So, I packed my bags and set off on my adventure. The first few days were amazing. The views were breathtaking, and I felt like I was on a postcard. I had the trails all to myself, and I was loving every minute of it. But as I was hiking deeper into the mountains, I started to feel like I was being followed. The trail was deserted, and I had not seen any other hikers for hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept turning around to see if anyone was behind me, but there was never anyone there. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling persisted. I started to feel paranoid and anxious, my heart racing with fear. I was so focused on the feeling of being followed that I didn't even notice the beauty of the mountains anymore. The feeling became even stronger as the day went on, and I started to hear strange noises behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I turned around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing on the trail behind me, were 3 creatures. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and heads that seemed too large for their bodies. Their skin was a sickly gray color, and their eyes were black and soulless. I froze, unsure of what to do. The creatures just stood there, staring at me. I pulled my phone out to take a picture of them, but as soon as I did, They started running towards me, and it made me panic. I lost my balance and fell to the ground, losing my phone in the process. I knew I had to get away fast, so I got up and started running as fast as I could. I ran for what felt like hours, but I couldn't shake them. Every time I looked back over my shoulder, I saw that the creatures were following me. They were always there, just behind me, their elongated limbs allowing them to keep pace with ease. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do. After a while, I stumbled upon what looked like an abandoned bunker deep in the mountains. I had heard that there were many bunkers made by the Swiss Army in the Alps, but I never thought I would find one. I pushed open the rusty door, and as soon as I stepped inside, chills went down my spine. The walls were covered in carvings depicting the same creatures that were following me. I knew that I was not the first person to see these creatures. A tunnel went further into the mountain, but it was pitch black inside, so I decided to stay in the first room. Old planks and empty beer cans were scattered on the floor. I barricaded the door and huddled in a corner, trying to catch my breath. But I could still hear them outside, rustling in the bushes. I peeked out a small opening in the wall and saw that they were hiding behind the trees, watching the bunker. They would occasionally poke their heads out, their black eyes staring at me. This went on for the whole night, and I was too scared to sleep. In the morning, the creatures were still there, lurking outside the bunker. I knew that I couldn't stay there forever, so I decided to explore deeper into the bunker. I walked down the dark and damp corridor, feeling my way with my hands, touching the walls, and using an old, rotten broom as my guide. As I walked, I felt as if someone was watching me, but I knew it couldn't have been the creatures, as I would probably have heard them destroy the barricaded door of the bunker. I finally reached the end of the corridor and opened the door to a large room. Inside, I felt something hanging on my right. I couldn't quite tell what it was. It could be clothes, maybe a uniform, or old rags, but I felt a metal helmet. It was clearly a helmet. And on my left, I felt a machine. I couldn't tell what it was, but I heard a soft humming noise coming from it. I reached out blindly, trying to find the source of the noise, and my hand landed on a switch. I flipped it on, and the machine came to life. Suddenly, the room was flooded with light, and it blinded me for a second. I could see that this room also had carvings against the walls, just like the ones I had seen previously. Even though the room looked odd and creepy, the fact that it wasn't pitch black anymore was somewhat relieving. There was a greenish door leading further into the bunker, and I noticed that the machine also triggered lights in the corridor that led me to this room. I turned around and got scared for a second when I saw the old army uniform hanging on the wall. It looked damp and moldy, as if it had been here for decades. I was starting to feel lightheaded, which was probably normal. After all, I hadn't slept for over a day, and the only food I had eaten was a local chocolate-coated wafer bar and a small sausage. I didn't pack a lot of food as there were small villages or rest stops everywhere in the Alps, and I had plans to sleep at a hotel the night prior. I was wondering if they tried to contact me or alerted the authorities. Maybe a search party was looking for me. But there was no way they would find me in this bunker. I sat down on the ground and leaned against the wall, trying to gather my thoughts and come up with a plan. As I sat there, I noticed a shadow on the wall, coming from the entrance corridor. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but no, I wasn't. It was moving. It was them. The creatures that had been following me were now inside the bunker. I quickly got up and slammed the door shut, which, luckily, could be closed from the inside. As soon as I did, I heard them rushing towards the door. I turned to the other door, but it was locked. I was trapped, with the creatures closing in on me. I could hear them scratching at the door, their elongated limbs reaching through the cracks. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die. I knew that I was going to die there, alone in that bunker, in a foreign country. But then I remembered the old Swiss Army uniform hanging on the mannequin. For some reason, my survival instincts kept making me look at that uniform. Was it because uniforms have a sense of authority? Was it because of its rotten smell? Was I going crazy? I don't know. I quickly put it on and grabbed the helmet, hoping it would give me some protection if the creatures attacked me. The creatures broke through the door, and I braced myself for the worst. But as they approached me, they suddenly stopped. They stared at me for a moment, then turned and fled back into the wilderness, as if they were scared. I never found out why they didn't attack me, but I was just glad to be alive. I quickly made my way back to civilization, but until today, I never spoke of the creatures I had encountered. I knew no one would believe me anyway, and I didn't want to be known as the crazy hiker who claimed to have been followed by monsters in the mountains.